Welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Our topic today is the nature of writer's block and how to overcome it. Our featured guest, Hilary Reddig, who was born in the Bronx, New York, and now lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, describes herself as a classic late bloomer who didn't start coming into her own professionally or personally until she was well into her 40s. And so she understands firsthand the despair that comes from feeling like you're not living up to your potential. Hilary has been able to design solutions to both procrastination and perfectionism that are uniquely targeted and effective. All her work is devoted to helping people locate and remediate the disempowering forces in their work and life so they can reclaim their joyful productivity. Her articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Huffington Post, Future Buzz, Time Management Ninja, Tomorrow's Professor, Authors Helping Authors, and numerous other publications. And she's been interviewed in Entrepreneur.com. During a prior career as a technology journalist and consultant, her articles appeared in Wired, Working Woman Incorporated, Technology, and elsewhere. She was also interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other publications. Hilary has also appeared as a guest on CBS TV News, WBAI, WBUR, and other broadcasts. She is the author of The 7 Secrets of the Prolific, the definitive guide to overcoming procrastination, perfectionism, and writer's block. Her first book was A Lifelong Activist, a self-help guide for progressive and radical activists, and it was from her activism that she gained insights on personal power that inform her current work. It was in the course of her work as business coach and microlender at 2 nonprofit agencies in Boston that she became acutely aware of the forces that hold so many talented, energetic, ambitious, and visionary people back. And it was this awareness that catalyzed her current mission to write and to help. Hilary, we're honored to have you as our featured guest. Welcome.
Christine, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Bob.
Yes, Hilary, it's such a pleasure to have you on as our featured guest today, and welcome to our audience.
Hilary, tell us about yourself and what led you to the work that you're currently doing.
Well, I think the most interesting and relevant thing I can say is that, as mentioned in the introduction, I had a fairly random career. I've done a lot of things. I've done some journalism. I did some technology consulting. And they all led me to a place in my mid-40s where I really was interested in helping people succeed. I had overcome some interior blocks in my own life, some pretty serious ones actually, and I could see them in other people who were very smart, savvy, dedicated people. And that really became the problem that I wanted to solve and to make a contribution in. And that's what I've been working on for the past 10 years.
Excellent, wonderful. I certainly understand that because both Bob and I see that in the work with our clients, that very, very smart people have these blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Great, Hilary. Can you tell our audience how you came to write your 7 Secrets of the Prolific book, and what was your biggest challenge in completing that book? Since we're talking about writer's block, did you personally have to wrestle with any of the tough issues you speak about, like perfectionism or procrastination?
Yes, I did. And I mean, it's very different than, in my 20s and 30s where I would basically rewrite the same chapter of a book and nothing but that chapter for, literally years. But I did. And I remember getting perfectionist while I was writing the section of the book on perfectionism. But I had a lot of techniques and I was able to use them. Some of them I describe on my website. I have the very good fortune of talking to people every day about their creative blocks, about their procrastination, and about their perfectionism. And so, I am very clear on what I need to do in my own life and in my own writing to recover. For instance, one thing I know, and I know this deep in my bones, is that perfectionism is always a dead end. Always. It never helps. And by perfectionism in this case, I mean harsh self-talk. The kind of dialogue or monologue that a lot of people succumb to when they're being underproductive. They're like, what's wrong with me? What's my problem? Why am I so lazy? Why can't I do this? It's easy, blah, blah, blah. I'm just a loser, whatever. I know deep, deep, deep in my bones, because I've seen this, with literally, hundreds of people over the past decade, that never helps. Never. And it only holds you back. And so when I am underproductive, I work very hard, and I'm very careful to maintain an even keel. And because of that, and to stay open to solutions, not moralizing, and because of that, I typically rebound fairly quickly and then get on with things.
Wow, that's great, Hilary. I just want to segue here briefly and just mention to our audience, right before the call, we briefly spoke about perfectionism, and since you just brought that up right at the beginning, I'd like you to briefly just tell our audience, or at least explain the quote that I'm going to read that you had in a blog post about some rock climbers about perfectionism. You said that, quote, perfectionism is by definition delusional, and perfectionist critiques are always invalid. When I read that, Hilary, that is a mind-blowing quote. So could you just talk a little bit about how you were incensed in that blog post about this amazing achievement that people did, and then how it applies to in the writing context?
Yes. That's a great question. Perfectionism is a fairly large phenomenon. I identify at this point something like 20 characteristics. Perfectionists define success narrowly and unrealistically. They define failure really broadly. Perfectionists use a lot of labeling and hyperbole. This is the hardest project ever. My work is garbage. I'm totally lacking in originality, etc. Perfectionists do a lot of comparisons. Perfectionists, they tend to be grandiose. They think that things that are difficult or impossible for other people should be easy for them. And I could go on and on and on and on. It is a delusional worldview and a delusional view of the self, and it's also pretty reductive. One problem, Bob, is that society itself is pretty perfectionist, and perfectionist narratives tend to be very simple and dramatic, and so you see them a lot in the media. When you read an advertising slogan like "just do it" or "no pain, no gain," that's perfectionist. It is vastly oversimplifying the process of success. When you see rags to riches stories or overnight success stories, now, a lot of us understand that, people leave details out of their stories to make themselves look more accomplished and achievable than they are. And we also understand that if anybody told the true tale of their success, it might be a long and fairly boring story until the very end, maybe, when it's exciting again. So we don't typically see the true process of success in the media and in the culture around us. We tend to see these rags to riches overnight, suffering is always worthwhile. In sitcoms, you'll often see people who have these fantastic jobs that nobody ever works, where they live in fantastic houses and nobody ever, how do they afford those houses? That's all perfectionist. And so it is delusional. And if you measure yourself against those kinds of standards, of course you're going to come out lacking and you're simply going to undermine yourself.
Wow, Hilary. If you could have seen the smile on Christine's face when you were talking, because I think one of the reasons we were excited to have you as our guest is that, reading your material, you have nailed so many of, it's not that there's a large literature on procrastination, time management, et cetera, but you have connected the dots in a way that's easy to understand. And so I'm very excited, and I think our audience is going to be very happy to hear as you provide us with more of your wisdom, because as the sense that I get from you is that, it comes from the school of hard knocks. And then, as you just said, that this overnight success took 20 years or 25 years. And then, I forgot, you just talked about the first 30 days, and then all of a sudden it's 25 years later and then your overnight success. So thank you for that. Let me ask you this question. This is an issue that has been on my mind for a long time. I wanted your opinion, Hilary, on how strong a fear writer's block represents. And what I'm talking about specifically is how would you compare the intensity of the underlying of fear attached to writer's block to the fear that many people have about public speaking? And, I think there was a Seinfeld episode where they said that the fear of public speaking was even stronger than the fear of death.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of that. Yep. Well, it's a super intense fear. And one of the things, yet another characteristic of perfectionism, Bob, is that we tend to over-identify with our work. So that if the work doesn't go well, it's a kind of ego demolition. And that explains, it's kind of an ego destruction. And that's where a lot of the fear comes from. The work doesn't just become something that you do, it just becomes the whole point and purpose of your life and your role in the world. So naturally, you're going to be terrified if you somehow fall short. And a perfectionist is basically destined to fall short because their conception of success is totally unrealistic. I actually define perfectionism as a kind of professional post-traumatic stress, PTSD, and because a lot of the symptoms of perfectionism are actually the same. So, perfectionists tend to be rigid. They tend to try the same solutions over and over again. They tend to want to control the outcomes of their efforts, which anyone would do if they were terrified. You obviously want to control what happens. But that's actually the opposite of a free creative process. Perfectionists also tend to dichotomize. They divide things into, black and white, total success, total failure, etc. A lot of these symptoms are shared by people who have PTSD. And while obviously having your work rejected in a traumatic way is not the same as living through a traumatic event, in your life or involving your person, it can still affect you in that kind of way. And I've spoken with clinicians who really do believe that the analogy between perfectionism and PTSD is very valid.
Wow, Hilary, that's the first time I've heard that. And I remember reading some of the comments, I believe it was the Chronicle of Higher Education, of scholars who had submitted their works to journals, to peer-reviewed journals, and they were complaining about the process. A couple of comments stood out in my mind where people were waiting 12 to 18 months just to find out if it was even going to be considered. And then when they finally got the rejection, there was no reason. They just said sorry, and they were talking about the angst that leads to, and that simultaneously they need their writing, to publish or perish type of environment.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're the first person I've actually heard talk about writing in that way, that linking that to PTSD. So that is a major insight, and I want to congratulate you on that. Let me ask you this,
Bob. Let me just say, because what you're describing totally fits, because those academics are literally trapped. I mean, in the real world, PTSD often or usually comes from the situation of actually being trapped, by crime or by war or by some kind of natural disaster. But you're actually talking about a group of academics who are literally trapped in their careers because they have to publish or perish, which is about as perfectionist a statement as anybody could come up with. And at the same time, the route to publishing is random, illogical, it's delayed, there's no feedback, there's no control, there's no real rational ability to manage it. So yes, the example that you gave, Bob, it absolutely works in this context of perfectionism being a form of professional PTSD.
Okay, great, Hilary. Thank you for that clarity. Well, since we're on this strain of scholarly writing, I'll just continue with this question. In his book entitled Writing for Social Scientists, Howard Becker says that many students fear others reading their work, especially before it's complete. Basically, what's happening here is that he says that students fear the potential for ridicule or humiliation, and that comes along with having their work being judged. So I wanted to ask you, Hilary, does that concept or notion ring true in your experience, and do you agree with that view?
Absolutely. And I have a really good example, Bob. when I teach live classes, meaning actually in the classroom, at places like Mark Twain House or Grove Street Writers, the very first thing I do after I walk in the room is I say, okay, we're going to do a little free writing exercise. I won't go into the details, but it's really a trivial little exercise. Now, everyone who's taking that class, and that can include academics, it can include lawyers, it can include creative writers, they're all there because they perceive themselves to be underproductive or even blocked. So I say, we're going to do this like little writing exercise. Get out your pens and paper. And I give them the instructions, and it's not that bad. And then the very last thing I say is, oh, by the way, you're not going to have to read this out loud. You're not going to have to show it to anybody. Every time I say that in every class, there is this huge collective sigh of relief. They were all terrified of having to show it or read it. So, yeah. And the tricky thing is, there's two tricky things. One is if somebody's afraid to show their work, they can get blocked at any part of the writing process. And some people will just like write and not show it, but some people might not even start to write because they're so terrified in advance. The other thing is showing your work early and often, showing your drafts, showing it to, showing bits and pieces. If you don't show your work, the wall between being unseen and seen just keeps growing and getting scarier. So showing your work early and often is a key productivity strategy because you bring that wall down, you become, much less frightened, much bolder, less fear of being seen, and you can really start writing a lot at that point. But yeah, I think Becker gets it completely right.
I have to tell you, Hilary, I was chuckling when you were talking because not only will I use that, because I think that what you said, the sigh of relief can be used in any context, whether it's for writing or anything, that the two things that popped into my mind was I was remembering being in the 10th grade. I went to Stuyvesant High School, and I had a math teacher who used to come in to the room, and the first thing he'd say is, okay, everyone put your books under your desk. We're going to have a pop quiz, right? So, and Hilary, it was always on the homework. So if you hadn't done your homework, you would forget it. And the worst part is that he would do the pop quiz, and then he would grade the papers immediately on the spot, and then he would hold up all the papers of the people who had failed the quiz, and they would have to come up to his desk to get that. So that's the ultimate in ridicule and
horrible.
Humiliation. And I was just thinking, especially at the age, imagine being 16 years old, because that is really, really rough to be humiliated in front of your peers, and everyone is thinking, oh, gee, I'm glad that's not me. And then the second thing that popped into my mind while you were talking, Hilary, was, when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I remember submitting the first draft to my dissertation chair, and I was just thinking, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so awful. I hope he has, I don't know what, I was just thinking he wasn't going to blast me. And it's so interesting that when I think about the process now in reverse, that it's over a while, that I recall him saying, because what you said is that the feedback is very important. And so one of the key things he said to me was, he goes, well, Bob, I don't think I should, since your dissertation is dealing with nitric oxide spiking, why am I waiting until page 57 to find out what it is, right? And so that was one of the most helpful things right there at the beginning, that I needed to put that more up front, so that it would be understood by the reader. And so I just wanted to mention that.
Well, definitely being judged and being looked at will trigger fears.
Absolutely. And the problem is that, unfortunately, there are a lot of bad teachers in the world. There are a lot of teachers who are insensitive to some of these issues. There are a lot of teachers who, are not very good at what they do, and then they're not going to admit it, but instead they'll blame the victim. And there are a lot of teachers are human like everybody else, and they're in the same perfectionist world that we're in. And so those are the kind of teachers that somehow think it's a good idea to march kids up to the front of the room for a public shaming. That's another example of how perfectionism is reductive. because who
Yes.
knows why a kid didn't do well on that particular morning. Maybe he had the flu, or maybe his brother had the flu, or, there could be any number of reasons. So, it's just perfectionism never works. It's always a dead end. And the fact that you remember that, so, decades later, the way that this guy would march kids up to the beginning of the room.
You bet I remember it.
Yeah. That terrifies me hearing it secondhand decades later.
Well, I was just glad I was never one of the kids, but I always wonder what happened to some of the people, because I remember they ended up not graduating.
I'm not surprised.
A
I'm
remedy
not surprised.
would be a scene from one of our favorite animated movies, Meet the Robinsons. There's a portion of the movie where failure is celebrated. The character failed, and everybody said, "Yay, you're one step closer to success."
I guess I'll have to watch that movie.
It's a great movie.
With it.
Hilary, you mention in your work disempowering forces. How are they at play in writer's block?
That's a great question, Christy. So, many of us can remember a time when we were young, when we were kids, where we used to create effortlessly. I certainly do. And if you watch kids, kids build, they sculpt, they write, they do all kinds of things. They're not in a judgmental space, and they have a great time doing it. And it's not even work for them, it's play. And then something happens to us over the years, for many of us, where it gets harder and harder and harder. And the things that happen to us are what I call the disempowering forces. Creativity is fundamentally an act of freedom, an act of empowerment. First of all, you're using your voice, particularly when you're writing. It's an act of using your voice. It's also an act of self-advocacy. And, there are a lot of reasons why, in society, why different groups of people might have more trouble doing that than others, obviously. But if you're having trouble, if someone's having trouble using their voice or advocating for themselves in the form of writing or work that is their mission that they want to be doing, we have to look at what is preventing that. Not that they're deficient. People who are underproductive often think that they are somehow deficient, that they're lazy or undisciplined or uncommitted, and obviously many of us are told that. But that is clearly not the case, because we all start out as creative, prolific kids, and many of us are creative and prolific in a whole range of other areas except the one that's most meaningful to us. Right? There's zillions of people out there who are they're dynamos in every area except their small business or their novel, their relationships, health or fitness, the one area that might be just the most important to them. Now, it's clear that they're not deficient. It's clear that something is holding them back or disempowering them in that one particular realm.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much. Yes, I have, again, that's something that I do find in my work, that someone will sometimes come to me for A, but as we work together, we see that B is really the issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, Hilary, in your rules for prolific writing, I really enjoy those. You mention one that's near and dear, I think, to many people. You speak about being selective about whom you show your work to. And, if you choose the quote-unquote wrong person, you might be opening yourself up to criticism. Someone may say a word, and then you put down your pen and you never go back to your writing.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular rule, how do you go about choosing the right person?
Well, you definitely want somebody who respects what you're doing and understands it. And those are the primary critiques. They respect what you're doing and they understand it. Now, that said, you can show your work to a wide range of people. They may not all be, PhDs in psychology or PhDs in literature, but they still may have something really useful to offer you. I think the thing that people need to understand, Christine, is it can be a little difficult to find, what I call your creative community. In other words, it can be hard to find the people, the small group of supporters whom you can feel absolutely safe sending your work to. That can take some time because, first of all, besides being respectful and understanding, they should really get what you're about. They should have the right temperament. They should not be perfectionists. They should understand how to give constructive criticism. I mean, there's not a lot of people out in the general population who maybe fit all those things. So one does have to be patient. That said, there are communities that have more of those people than in the general population. So you do want to find a writers group or a business group or another creative group that has the right culture of non-competitiveness, of cooperation, of compassion. They're out there, and some of them are even online. Although I know plenty of people who drive an hour or more each way once a month to see the people in person. It's that important. So those groups are out there, and when you find them, that's usually the shortcut to finding the good group of people who can support your work and critique it in a constructive way.
That makes a lot of sense, that you do a little bit of interviewing and some research to find just the person who can be supportive and can give you a worthwhile critique.
Mm-hmm.
Hilary, Bob and I, when we saw your work, we just said, this woman is a genius and we have to have her on the show. And we too want to thank you so much for being our guest and sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. Hilary, would you tell our listeners about your services and how they can contact you or work with you if they would like to?
Thank you, Christine. And let me just say I've had a really wonderful time here and talking with both of you. And so I am grateful for your understanding and appreciation for my work. So my website is www.hilaryreddig.com. That's HILLARYRETTIG as in girl. If you Google Hilary with 2 L's and procrastination or perfectionism, you'll probably find my website. Right now, I am doing some coaching, which I typically do one-on-one over the phone. I'm not doing a lot of teaching because I'm working on a couple of extra books, a couple of new books. One book is on a version of the 7 Secrets of the Prolific for high school and college students. It's going to be much shorter, and it's going to be very specific to their needs. And the other book that I'm working on is actually on weight loss and fitness and the same themes. I think this is going to be the only book out there, certainly the only major book out there, that identifies procrastination, perfectionism, and time constraints as major barriers to weight loss. So those are what I'm working on now, and if people are interested in hiring me as a coach, I do work with people all around the world.
That's fantastic. Those books sound really exciting. Thank you so much, Hilary. So listeners, if you'd like to contact Hilary, go to her website at www.hilaryreddig.com. That's HILLARYRETTIG. Hilary, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine and Bob. It's been wonderful for me, too. Really appreciate it.
Yes, Hilary, what final thoughts or key ideas would you like our audience to take away from today's broadcast about writer's block?
Thank you so much for asking that, Bob. Here's what I want the audience to think. If you are underproductive or blocked, it is, first of all, a solvable problem. You need to locate the disempowering forces in your life and in your work, and they can almost always be solved, and many of them can be solved almost completely. Some of them might not be completely solved, but you can still make progress, and it's a worthwhile task to work on. If you are underproductive, do not for a moment think it's because you're deficient in any way. Never use labels like lazy, undisciplined, or uncommitted for yourself, or never use them on anybody else. If you are feeling lazy or uncommitted, ask yourself why. Say, I'm feeling lazy. I'm feeling like I'm not really committed to this project. Why is that? And instead of descending into this shame spiral or moralization, simply answer the question. The answer is going to reveal the actual causes of the underproductivity, and now you have problems that you can work on by yourself or even better with your supportive community. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, wonderful, Hilary. And I think that our audience really will appreciate the practical nature of your advice. That it's really advice that once they finish listening to this podcast, that they can put one or more of the techniques to use. So, Hilary, I want to thank you for today's interview, and I want to thank our audience for listening, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are in. We welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to experience the same benefits our coaching clients get with us and learn how to get control of your schedule or easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, or anxiety, feel free to call us at 954-900-2179. Mention that you heard our Stress Free Now podcast show, and your first session is absolutely free. Call today to schedule your appointment. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.